They don't get the things we say prior to the recording. All right, let us begin The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And please do note my pronunciations of these German names. Sometimes they look particularly English. Thomas Mann is how we would say his name in American English, but do keep in mind that his name is, in fact, Thomas Mann. Hopefully that will catch things. I don't have many images for you today, but I thought that I would at least include one of Thomas Mann and his wife, Katja, who had 6 of his children. This has been in 1941 when they're a little bit older. We will be reading a text from 17 years earlier, a text that itself was supposed to be a companion to a text that would come 29 years earlier, 1912, a death in Venice. So let's talk a little bit about Thomas Mann's time and a brief summary of his life and his major works. Thomas Mann was born in 1875, died in 1955, so he lived contemporaneously with James Joyce, our last law. James Joyce, Irish. Thomas Mann was a German who lived for a good deal of his life in Switzerland and then in my native California, and then back in Switzerland at the end of his life. For reasons I will mention concerning him, he did not return to Germany after fleeing there in 1933. Do any of you know what is particularly interesting about Germany or salient about Germany in 1933? Yes? The end of the Weimar Republic, which started in 1918 with the end of the Second Reich, the Kaiserreich, and the rise of the National Socialists, known colloquially to Americans as the Nazis. He was a major opponent of the Nazis. He gave public lectures that you can still read, and in fact, stopped writing Magic Mountain to write a work on called something like Unpolitical Investigations. Unpolitical is part of the title. I think I have it here, but that is not a perfect rendering of its name. Something I wish to convey about him, and this is something that I think comes a little bit later in the lecture, but I'll mention it immediately because it's important, is that he, unlike many artists, and particularly many German artists of his time, found himself on the right side of history. There were great thinkers, philosophers like Martin Heidegger, very famously became a Nazi, and this is held against him to this day. Even Americans like Ezra Pound, who was so influential in getting James Joyce's Ulysses published, turned to fascism. The Italians turned to fascism and wrote in support of that. So perhaps there are 2 reasons for you to dislike Ezra Pound, for his fascist tendencies and because he got the work he most recently had to read, Ulysses, published. Something I hope that you enjoy about this text is that reading The Magic Mountain after Ulysses is sort of like, I would imagine, eating a really delicious, soft dessert after eating a pretty healthy, but very foul-smelling fish prior to it. It's good for you. It's a fine sort of meal, but it's not delicious and delightful to the senses in the same way that a very sugary dessert. In any case, Thomas Mann was always an opponent of National Socialism. And one reason that Thomas Mann studies have taken so long to take off is because many Germans, including the artists and intellectuals of his day, after the fall of the Third Reich in 1945, made, of course, the claim that they were somewhat duped by National Socialism and what it aimed to do and what it actually did with its extermination of 6 million Jewish people, which is part of why the state of Israel exists nowadays, because of the moral blight on the West that many people felt, which is very interesting. In any case, many of his contemporary intellectuals felt somewhat indicted by the fact that he always stood against National Socialism. He left Germany and continued to speak against their actions where many of his contemporaries did not. And so, because he took such a strong stand against socialism, when they claimed they could not have known what the consequences of that political system was, it sort of seems like they're lying. And so his strong integrity offers a great counterbalance against the lack of integrity of many of those who were his contemporaries. And I cannot underline this enough. I do not think that I couldn't know if we fell under a fascist system, what I would do. I know what I would want to do. But it is really hard to convey how difficult it would be for him to actually stand against these people and to repatriate himself to another country while continuing to have a focus on his original people. This is something almost nobody would do, and almost nobody would be capable of doing, and almost nobody would have the moral fabric of doing. So this is something important about this thinker, and this is something I wish for you to know about this thinker. And this is something, again, which, since we've already underlined, I wish to highlight about this text. It is sometimes considered by scholars deeply unpolitical, very, very apolitical. I mean, it's about a young man who goes to a tuberculosis sanatorium for 3 weeks, spends 7 years there, and sort of experiences a moral decay while he's there. It's like he has dropped out of life, as if he is living the least political life possible. And yet some of the characters that we meet along the way, Lodovico Sembrini, Leo Nafta, Minier Peppercorn, look forward to meeting 2 of the 3 of those a little bit later, offer themselves insights into philosophy and politics that might suggest an underlying political nature to this text. Unlike Ulysses, which is somewhat heavy-handed in its politics and its philosophy and its theology, Joyce throws his learning in your face and makes you feel a tremendous sense of absence, right? Because wow, how much has this person learned? Thomas Mann, also exceptionally sharp, also exceptionally learned, but he has a much lighter touch. So his narrator is often considered very garrulous, funny, and interesting. And reading this text is much easier than reading Ulysses, and often, as I mentioned earlier with the dessert reference analogy rather, much more pleasant. But you will find in this text moments of tremendous philosophical significance, the excursus on time, for example. Is time subjective, as Hans Castorp believes, or is it objective, as his cousin Joachim suggests, when he says, well, no, we measure things by hours, days, months, and the end of the month comes the same for anybody, regardless of what they think. Yet, I will remind you that many different calendars have existed during the course of time, and there are still different calendars that are used, like the AH calendar used by Muslims, which go back to the life of Muhammad. What is the term there? Well, the founder of their religion. In any case, there is a more technical term for Muhammad. He is called the prophet. There we go. The prophet. Very like how Moses is a prophet. That's something shared between Judaism and Islam. Interesting. All right. Well, let me get back to the slides here because I've gone a little bit afield, and I am going to get to what we have to say. And I do want to say a little bit more about Mann's other works because they are very, very interesting, and they'll touch on some themes that we haven't touched on quite as much in this class. In particular, Death and Venice, 1912, 2 years before the outbreak of World War I. Very short little novel, very, very popular. It is a strange sort of Faustian novel. Why do I say Faustian? Particularly when 35 years later he writes a work called Dr. Faustus. Well, it is about an aging, popular, famous author who is burnt out and wants to go on a trip. Goes on a trip from Germany to Venice. If you've never been to Venice, Venice is a city that would be very difficult to leave quickly because of all the walls around it and the water surrounding it as well. So if something like a plague were to break out in Venice, it would be a particularly bad place to be if you wish to escape. This character, this Aschenbach, this Gustav von Aschenbach, notice the von in suggesting that he has rank and land like a dove in French and Spanish. He goes to Venice and he falls in love, perhaps in lust, with a young boy named Tadzio. He never talks to him. This is a theme that we see again in The Magic Mountain with Claudia Shosha and Shibislaw Hippa and Hans Castorp. It's not approaching the objects of his desire. And yet this Aschenbach falls so deeply in lust with this Tadzio that even when he has clear evidence that plague is going to take the city of Venice, he should flee. He gives into his lust, stays. He does not warn Tadzio, though he wishes to in his sort of heart of hearts, but he follows not his heart in this instance. And so he condemns both himself and Tadzio and his family, who is there either vacationing or live there, I'm not recalling at the moment, to death. And so he literally chooses lust over life in this case. And so sort of a representation of what Freud would call the sex instinct, but perhaps also the death instinct. He puts them on different ends of the pole, but in this case, they're very much related. And Sigmund Freud, as well as Carl Jung, were two major psychoanalysts who were big influences on Thomas Mann, not to mention his philosophical influences from Arthur Schopenhauer from the early 19th century, the first Western philosopher to take Buddhism and Eastern philosophy seriously. He said that the will is an illusion at the end of his world as will. I'm forgetting the exact title in English, but it's World as Will and Representation, or something like that, in 2 volumes. A very famous blue and red volume these days, so I forget the translator. So again, just to mention a point earlier, Thomas Mann's intellectual influences are very heavy influences, though they are distinct from James Joyce's. James Joyce very much influenced by the Jesuits in medieval philosophy, like I mentioned prior to the recording. Thomas Aquinas and Jesuitical. Thomas Mann's head is filled with German Romanticism, Goethe in terms of literature, Schiller in terms of literature, but also major German philosophers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. A claim that I'm not going to stick by 100%, but that I think I can make with some safety is that the 19th century belonged to German thinkers. They were the most powerful thinkers. Hegel, G.W.F. Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, and they are all based on the most profound 18th century philosopher, which is a little more contentious claim, but sometimes not, Immanuel Kant, himself a German thinker. And so the Germans were extremely intellectually, culturally advanced people, which made the horrors of 1914 to 1918, and of course 1933 to 1945 all the more significant. That said, The Magic Mountain was first published in 1924. Make sure I'm going to say more about it in a second. Yes, I am. There was a tetralogy, Joseph and His Brothers, 1933. The 3 tetralogy is a trilogy plus 1. And then, of course, Dr. Faustus, 1947. A clear connection between this great German writer and the greatest German writer, Goethe. The conceit behind this text. So remember one of the claims we make about modernism. Where is God in modernism? Yes?
Mutable source.
Mutable source, okay, perhaps. What is another way of saying, where is God in modernism? Yes? Dead. Nietzsche's claim. God is dead and we have killed him. There is no God. And so, remember the conceit of Faust. There's a pact made with the devil. We still have this in our language. Faustian bargain. Not the same as a Faustian bargain, by the way. And so, what is the pact with the devil in this Dr. Faustus? I can say, I think, with some definition, that you will love this and think it weird. Perhaps there's a connection between those two. The deal with the devil is allegorized in Dr. Faustus by a successful author wishing to pursue genius, consciously infecting himself with syphilis. You may know a little bit about syphilis. It is considered one of the worst STIs that exist, sexually transmitted infections, called infections, not diseases these days. You may also know very famously that Friedrich Nietzsche contracted syphilis, we think, during a Prussian campaign where he was acting as a nurse, and which eventually led to him, very sadly, going insane in his 39th year and dying by, I think, his 46th or 47th. Just a quick note about that. So you should know that his Beyond Good and Evil, which is a text that many people read by Nietzsche and think is characteristic of his thought, was very much edited by his brilliant sister after his death without his authorization. So whether that represents his true thought at all is something you might want to keep in mind. But part of the folk wisdom underlying syphilis was that once you contracted it and the fever started to set in, syphilis in fact doesn't show many symptoms at first. And when it starts showing them again decades later, it's too late. But the idea was that it would enhance one's artistic creativity and intellectual capacity. But in 24 years, the devil would come collect his due and one would go crazy. I'll also mention that one of the symptoms or problems of syphilis is that one's face sometimes starts to rot off. So it is a really ugly disease. So this person wishing to contract syphilis and die in 24 years by going crazy in order to produce art is very fascinating in some ways. In any case, Mann was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1929, largely on the strength of his Magic Mountain as well as Death in Venice. He left Germany in 1933 after the rise of National Socialism, with now seizure of power, lived in Switzerland for some time, and then moved to the United States in 1939. As I told you, I'm very proud of the fact that he moved to California. Mann was a member of the League of Nations Committee on Intellectual Cooperation. He was politically involved for his whole life, and you can still read his very powerful speeches. He was known to be a great thinker during the course of his life and was often asked to give major lectures on Goethe, on Schiller. Yes.
So back to what you just said.
The 27 Club comes from several figures from the 20th century, who mostly musicians who died young, like Jimi Hendrix. I don't know whether Mann is related to that at all, but I think that's a really interesting question. I might look it up and let us know. So he was a member of the League of Nations Committee on Intellectual Cooperation, established in 1922 for the purpose of building up international relations among teachers, artists, scientists, and members of other intellectual professions, improving the working conditions of the educated workforce. Such notable members of this organization were Albert Einstein, and Marie Curie, and composer Bela Bartok. In 1926, the committee moved from Geneva to Paris, where it was reestablished as the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation. So this is a person that, even though the Magic Mountain may seem so or unpolitical, was himself very much steeped in politics, which I'll say more about with the construction of the Magic Mountain. So it was published in 1924, but he started work in 1914. Did it take him 10 years to write it? No, sort of like with Cervantes and Don Quixote, he first conceived of the project as much smaller than it turned out to be, which you will have noticed in your reading. There are 7 chapters. As we know from Ralph Bell's presentation, 7 is a big part of this text. By the 4th chapter, we've been 7 days in the city, we spent 7 days in the Berghof. Hans Castorp's mother, father, and grandfather died before his 7th year. There are 7 tables where people eat dinner in the Berghof restaurant, and of course, Hans Castorp ends up spending 7 years at this place. And the particular 7 years are 1907 to 1914. So this takes place 3 years and up to 10 years beyond Bloomsday in June 16th, 1904. And Ulysses, very similar time, goes all the way up to World War I. And in fact, the closing scene of the text, I don't think this will spoil this text, but just to give a little spoiler alert, is that Hans Castorp will be on a battlefield in Flanders, Belgium, which was one of the major theaters of war. I have a note on this right here, and I guess I'll quote from it. From 1914 to 1918, Flanders Fields was a major battle theater, I guess was a major battle theater, funny collective nouns, on the Western Front during the First World War. 1 million soldiers from more than 50 different countries were wounded, missing, or killed in action here. Entire cities and villages were destroyed, the population scattered across Europe and beyond. That's sometimes called the diaspora. People scattered, whether it be one people or another. And so this work was originally conceived as a comic companion to A Death in Venice, obviously a tragedy with the death of this writer and this young person's plague and a giving into lust. And in fact, something I think you will have noticed, the first 4 chapters that take place over the first 3 weeks of Hans Castorp's visit to the Berghof take up around 200 pages of this around 900-page novel. And so, like with Don Quixote's, or like with Cervantes' Don Quixote, the original scope of the project was much more constrained, much smaller than what it would have become. In fact, now this text is known as one of the great long novels of the 20th century. But how did it burgeon, how did it grow to such size? Well, from 1914 to 1915, Mann wrote through chapter 4 and the Shivaslav subchapter with still close to 820 pages to go, if you consider the low quarter translation edition, which beware, on Z Library, if you download the EPUB version that says John Woods on the front, it is actually the low quarter translation. And so beware. he laid this work aside during World War I for 4 years while he worked on Reflections of an Unpolitical Man. He's an unpolitical man who's making a political statement. In fact, some people say, because he's getting, I think, close to 40 at this time, that he should have been more mature. And he, like many artists would say, he says, are you really mature by the time you're 40? What about by the time you're 70? Maybe it takes an entire life to become mature. It's a somewhat beautiful artistic response. In any case, in 1919, after some time away from this text, somewhat similar, but for different reasons from Cervantes, he returns. So this too is a text. It changes in scope, and an author returns to after a major event in time. So with Don Quixote, obviously there was a spurious Don Quixote written, which reinvigorated Cervantes' creative energies to, or made him want to resuscitate just in order to kill his major protagonist, Don Quixote. Well, here World War I intervenes. So whereas James Joyce was writing Ulysses during the course of World War I, and perhaps including the confusion of its ethics and science and thoughts on religion and life into his work, Thomas Mann spent that time being a little bit more political and then returned to his art at the beginning of the Weimar Republic. It went on sale 8 weeks after it was published in 1924. Part of this is because his novel was published serially at times. To be published serially means that in newspapers or literary journals, parts of the text, chapters in particular, would be published in order to gauge public interest to see whether the text should be published as a whole. This is a convention that was very popular in the 19th century. In fact, the Sherlock Holmes stories by Conan Doyle were serialized in this way, and same with Charles Dickens's stories as well. You might wonder how they got so large, because they're very serial, at times and very popular as well. Many have argued, as I said earlier, that this text is in fact political. Many have argued on the opposite side that this text is in fact unpolitical. But it does show a vision of Weimar Germany. Though it takes place 1907 to 1904, it has the mature perspective, somebody writing from 1919 to 1924 at the beginning of a new republic, a republic that's sort of like the Star Wars republics that we see on Disney Plus now was doomed not to last particularly long, as something very similar to what the Empire is in Star Wars came to power in instead of Weimar Germany, in Weimar Germany, and in fact replaced it with, as we said, National Socialism. As I said earlier, Mann was always a fervent opponent of National Socialism, unlike figures like Martin Heidegger and Ezra Pound. And because of his firm resistance in speech and writing, Thomas Mann studies took time to get off the ground in German. Worth repeating. All right, let me give a brief synopsis of the Magic Mountain. I really wanted to get through describing chapters 1, 2, and 3 today, but I don't think I'm going to, though we do have a presentation on chapter 4. But let me say a little bit more globally. This story is the story of an ordinary or mediocre young man. It's a difficult translation issue. The Loeb Porter translation, which is 900 pages long, has ordinary. The Woods translation, which I assigned to you, which is 706 pages long, 194 pages fewer than the Loeb Porter, has him as a mediocre young man. I just want you to think about the connotation of those words in our language. Ordinary, not something good to be called. We want to be extraordinary. But to be mediocre has a little bit more of a sting to it. To say that was a mediocre effort would be like me saying that was a pedestrian effort. There's something a little harsher in calling someone mediocre. But unlike Stephen Davis, remarkable. Unlike Leopold Bloom, also remarkable. Unlike Molly Bloom, a professional opera singer, remarkable. This is a pretty normal young guy. This is the sort of person that perhaps you do not wish to be like. Perhaps there are many ways you would like him, like the Underground Man, but not in ways that you wish to aspire. Or perhaps you descriptively are like him, but normatively you wish to be much more. And he comes to the Berghof and Davos-Platz, Switzerland for 3 weeks, and then ends up staying for 7 years. While at the sanatorium, assumed to be engineer, he first takes this trip after he's finished his examinations and received his first job, but has not yet gone to his job. So this is his sort of summer vacation before he goes to take on his job or responsibilities, his professional responsibilities as an adult. And so he leaves the study of engineering to study biology, music, and even the occult. He will, in fact, summon his spirit from the dead with Dr. Krukowski. the psychoanalyst by the end of it. And a dead person very close to his heart, perhaps close to our own hearts, by the time that he does so. We did that. He develops a love interest with a married Russian woman named Claudia Shosha. The last name is not her name or her original name, which was Russian. We hear from the teacher who sits at the table with Hans Castorp when he first joins. He will eventually set all 7 tables. We spend so much time there. But this is a large conceit of the novel. He meets an Italian rationalist, progressive named Lodovico Settembrini. He's extremely verbally articulate, far more so than Hans Castorp, so much so that Hans Castorp sort of picks and chooses what he learns from Settembrini, and Settembrini, in fact, calls Hans Castorp life's problem child and admonishes him to the work off immediately so that the sedentariness and the moral lassitude of the place does not set in. Given the fact that you know that he spent 7 years there, clearly it does. And clearly, Lodovico Settembrini loses this battle, but to be a teacher is to lose many battles. The 2 physicians of the mountains are Director Behrens, who himself has purple cheeks, white hair, and watery eyes. Watery eyes that are described by the narrator as if he's still mourning for his wife. He first came to the mountain not by assignment, but because his wife had tuberculosis. And after she died, he stayed there. And the suggestion is that either he caught a little bit of tuberculosis and it was safer for him to stay there, or that he wanted to stay by her grave because he was very devoted to her. Very sad. Dr. Krukowski, very interestingly, is himself a psychoanalyst who finds the root of all illness in obfuscations of love. And so any illness one has is because of a maladaptive love. This is very much, I think, a parody of psychoanalysis, which finds many of the neurotic tendencies and anxieties of modern life in repressed emotions, particularly in repressed sexual emotions. And so something very interesting to think about. They are described in a very learned way by Settembrini as Rhadamanthus and Minos. Any of you remember your Virgil's Aeneid or your Dante's Inferno or your Homer's Odyssey and who these Cretan figures are? Minos, of course, the king of Crete and father of the Minotaur, and Rhadamanthus, his brother, are the judges of the dead. So Settembrini says that although you think you have ascended up a mountain, you've in fact descended to the depths of the dead. And something I'd be very interested in seeing you articulate in writing, either an essay or exam form, is how is it that those in a tuberculosis sanatorium are already called the dead, particularly when they are not all doomed to die? There are people who get better and leave the sanatorium. Hans Castorp will leave, though whether he was ever sick is a good question. Eventually, the ethnically Jewish and yet Jesuit, that means Catholic, Leo Nafta, and the inarticulate but grand Veneer Peppercorn will add their perspectives to Settembrini's. Leo Nafta, more like a Jesuitical communist. I'll say more about that later. Veneer Peppercorn, like a grand sensualist, loves the pleasures of the body, and in fact will be the lover of Hans Castorp's former lover, Claudia Shosha, when she returns to the tuberculosis sanatorium, where Hans Castorp will be waiting for her. Drama. The text ends with Hans Castorp returning to the flatlands, as they call it, from his life in the horizontal position and storming the fields of Flanders. In fact, it's sort of a poignant moment because he is storming the fields of Flanders. We're wondering what's going to happen to him, and the narrator leaves the story at that. This may create that the feeling in you that you may have had at times when you leave characters in a story that you particularly love, and you wonder what happens to them afterwards. I think, though this is obviously not the greatest story to have ever existed, and not even from the original Arabian Nights, but I think of Disney's Aladdin, and I think of Jasmine and Aladdin on the magic carpet, sailing off into not the sunset, but to the moon. What happens afterwards? And yeah, he dies like the 50 million other people that died in Flanders, but we don't know. That goes beyond the scope of this story. All right. In 1 minute, I'm just going to mention the major themes of the Magic Mountain. Many of them, these are not the only ones, but these are, I think, the biggest one. Time. Is it subjective or objective? Think about the passage of time. Think about the passage of time in a novel. The first 3 weeks take up the first 4 chapters. The final 3 chapters take up 7 years or so. It's sort of odd. You may think about novels. Ulysses is an 800-page novel that takes place over the course of how long? a single day. This is an 800-page novel. It takes place over the course of 7 years. That's pretty odd, right? How can you fill the same amount of pages with such differing amounts of time? Death is a huge part of this task. Hans Castorp is almost born to it. His mother dies before he's 7. His father dies before he's 7. He's sent to his grandpa, who then dies on him. And so perhaps he is comfortable in the tuberculosis sanatorium, he suggests, because he has been a friend to death the majority of his life. In fact, we haven't seen this yet, but he will end up going to visit those who are called the moribundum, those who are doomed to die, who are going to die very soon. Which would be, I don't know if any of you have ever worked with dying people, but it is a very, most people have to learn how to deal and be around dying people. It's extremely uncomfortable for people who have not been around the dying to be around them. And this is why, priests can be particularly lovely individuals. And if you go to hospitals to visit friends as you age, you will see priests often over and over again going up and down the elevators. And so mental, physical, moral latitude, and then of course, Germany, just some geopolitics, Germany and its relationship to Britain and Russia. Hans is studying ocean steamships. This is to mark that British naval dominance was huge at this time over the Germans. Obviously, we have the greatest navy in the world now, and the Germans and British barely have any. But at this time, they were still major powers and were competing with each other for naval dominance. Also, Russia is a natural enemy to Germany because they share a border. This is an Indian political science idea that any country that is that shares a border with another country is a natural enemy. Any country that shares a border with your natural enemy, but not with you as your natural ally. You might wonder about the US situation. I'd say we've done quite a bit of work to try and make that not the case, but it was the case during the Cold War that obviously the Russians tried to influence the politics of Latin America and particularly Mexico. It was also done during World War II by the Nazis. Obvious geopolitical strategy is to get allies that border enemies on one side if one's enemy to them. It makes a lot of sense. Okay, there's more for me to say, but not today, because Alessia, you've got to hear you, and you have a lot of good things to say, and see y'all.